So what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you some of the latest insights that we have produced with our annual report called the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends Report that just was issued on the 16th of January. I wanted to kind of put this in a bit of a broader context. You see the title here, Future of Work in an Age of Shortages, because I think that's especially for advanced OECD economies where there are specific challenges that I think are interesting to highlight. I'm happy to also kind of broaden the discussion later on once we open up the Q&A, maybe going into some of the issues that I'll touch upon or some of the issues that you find particularly relevant in that context. Let me just kind of phrase maybe or frame the discussion this evening in terms of these interconnected challenges, or what some people have called it polycrisis, where we really see this, 4 or 5 major trends happening at the same time, and they are not only interconnected, they have the tendency to worsen each other. So you see, obviously, the automation is the big topic of the day. AI was kind of just recently again in the news, and will certainly be with us for the foreseeable future. But underlying the kind of more headline indicators around automation, we see that there's a large shift also in terms of demographics. We obviously heard all of us heard about population aging, but the implication is not always entirely clear. And I think what I'm trying to deliver in this evening's talk is, focusing specifically on some of the implications that we see as they relate to the labor market. And then the two other major challenges, climate change and trade. Well, we haven't seen much in terms of happening in terms of trade the last 12 or 18 months. We are probably going to see much more happening this coming 4 years, I guess. Again, I'm happy to kind of talk or touch upon some of the topics if you're interested later on in the report that we just released that focuses on the last year. Obviously, not much was there on trade, but we touch upon on issues related to industrial policies, and the specific implication this might have for productivity growth and subnational developments. And then climate change is obviously something that is always on our minds, and will kind of create the backdrop to some of the challenges that we currently observe. So let me just kind of maybe start by framing the overall labor market picture. And as I said, the publication that we have released is called the World Employment and Social Outlook Trends Report, which means that we really look at the global picture. There are obviously cross-country or cross-regional differences in terms of how these tendencies pan out, but I think that it's useful to have some kind of this picture of the broad trends that we are seeing. And one of the interesting observations that we have, you see that here on the left side, is the fact that unemployment, as it's traditionally measured, is really at the lowest point ever since we have, statistics, global statistics at the ILO. So our statistics on unemployment starts in 1991, not because there was no unemployment before, it's simply because the harmonized data that we collect doesn't reach back further before 1991. And so if you look at the global picture, you kind of see here that the statistics starts only in 2004. But even over that short period, there was this blip with COVID, which has affected a few industrialized countries and some emerging economies. And then since then, we kind of reached low rates. Currently, we're standing at 5%. We are projecting this by the end of next year. We're going to 4.9, which from a statistical point of view doesn't really make much of a difference. You do also see that we have a second measure, which we call the jobs gap, which is a broader measure, includes all those people who are actually interested in having a job, of kind of would like to work, but for various reasons are either discouraged or are currently unavailable on the labor market. And so this broader job category, which we kind of talk about, around 402 million jobs globally missing in this category, is also at its lowest point historically speaking. And then I think a major issue here in this chart is obviously the huge discrepancy between experience that men have in comparison to women. Women kind of face significantly higher joblessness rates than men, even though the rates have come down for women as well, but there is still a more than 4 percentage point gap for women in comparison to men. And that is against the backdrop that women tend to be less active on the labor market. So it's not only that they have higher unemployment rate, they also are much less integrated into the labor market. So the overall jobs gap, if you want, the absolute number of jobs missing for women is much larger. What is interesting to notice, or the question obviously is, why do we see this kind of major drop in unemployment? And that's, you see that here, this is an updated chart from LinkedIn. We have produced something similar also already last year, is in terms of there's a strong labor demand for people, as a strong demand for people on the labor market. So obviously, yeah, especially in this with the situation in Europe, where kind of demand has slowed down significantly over the last 12 months, we are seeing sliding back, but there are enough countries, especially in the emerging world, where labor demand is still very strong and much stronger than before COVID. So if you obviously there was this huge drop in the first half of 2020, and then quite quickly after this, after these first measures kind of were introduced, labor demand started to rise again, and you see that for some countries here we have India or Brazil, or so the labor demand is still much higher than it used to be, and that is certainly something that's driving these massive significant drops in global unemployment. And I insist so much on this point because a lot of the discussion in the last 10-15 years has been around how automation and especially the digital transformation will make make all of us lose our jobs. And apparently that doesn't seem to be the case, at least over that time frame that we were just analyzing. Obviously, nobody knows the future, but for the moment, it looks like the labor demand is very high and unemployment is very low. Having said that, there are issues in terms of the supply side. So we talked about the demand side, we talked about the low unemployment rate, but there is an issue with the supply side. And the supply side is what you see on the left side of this chart, is that across the sectors. So this is for mostly for advanced economies. You see the list underneath here. For most sectors, or almost for all sectors, if you want, the number of hours worked per person in each sector has declined over the last 4 or 5 years. So this is here we see the difference between 2022 and 2019. But this situation is kind of the same if you extend that time frame to now. And so that means that essentially, even though you have all these people in jobs, they actually work less hours than before. You do see a slight change in terms of the total number of hours worked. So that means that those people, even though they might work less hours per week, there are more people working, so that compensates to a certain extent. And you see that there is a significant difference between certain sectors, especially IT and real estate, transportation as well. Public administration, interestingly enough, as well, has seen a huge surge over the last few years. Whereas then other sectors, especially hospitality, even in manufacturing, we're losing our jobs. Manufacturing is very interesting to note here. That it's a sector that is in significant stagnation in advanced economies, not so much in emerging economies. So China obviously is one of those countries who has seen a significant or continuous strong demand in manufacturing, but in advanced economies, and especially in continental Europe, where a lot of countries still rely heavily on manufacturing, the manufacturing sector has started to shed jobs, and obviously with consequences for employment, but also for living standards and wages in this sector. So I mean, just to kind of put the picture here to fully on the table, is we're seeing a significant shift both in the demand side, as I said before, but also on the supply side. And in the supply side, not so much in terms of the number of people in jobs or the number of people who are active, but in terms of how many people are actually how many hours people are actually working per week. Now, having said that, again, these are average pictures, and in labor markets, you always have to be very careful in terms of which category of persons you're looking at. Here, one of the categories that we are very much concerned about the situation is young people. youth unemployment rate is still very high and hasn't really experienced the same type of drop that we saw for the adult categories or the overall population. You see here the number. So you see this if you look on the left side chart, this pink solid line here. That's for the world as a whole, and you see that. The number now, so we're talking about over 12% of young people are unemployed. So that means that more than the unemployment rate for young people is more than double the one for the total population, and it's still significantly higher than at the beginning of the observation period. Obviously, you have some categories like high-income countries where this has come down. Partly also that's also because of demographics, but it's still I mean, a still significant gap with respect to the rest of the population. And again, the number for high-income countries really hides large heterogeneity. If you think about countries like Switzerland, where the youth unemployment rate is around 7%, 6-7%, whereas in other countries like Sweden, we're still talking about 22%, and then you have countries like Greece or Italy where still have over 30% of young people unemployed. And then there is an additional category of youth, or youth, if you want, youth inactivity, which is this need category where you look not only into whether young people are in employment, but also whether they are actually, if they're not in employment, are at least in education or training. And you see that there is a persistently high share of young people who are neither employed nor in education nor in training. So we actually don't know what they're doing. They're sitting probably at home, doing something, I don't know, playing video games or so, but certainly not in an actively involved in the labor market. And that creates enormous barriers for these young people to then integrate the labor market later on. I mean, even a six months an unemployment spell for young people essentially deteriorates their experiences on the labor market of 10, 15 years out. So it's even short spells of unemployment has significant long-term consequences, negative long-term consequences for young people. The other important category of people on the labor market that could or needs to have a better integration is, I mentioned that already, is women. You see there's the gender gap in unemployment rate here on the left is kind of being split depending on the country region. I mean, I mentioned already, for the global picture, how big the difference is here. You see that also for different countries, for different regional countries. So high income countries are the only category where we'd say that it declines somewhat for the other countries. For the unemployment gap is either increasing or stable. For the world as a whole, it has significantly increased over that period that we're looking at. And what is problematic with this is that especially from upper and or middle income countries overall, there's a major negative impact on their living standards. So we calculated it so there are obviously differences across regions, but one of the regions that is significantly or produces shows a negative example here is Northern Africa and Arab states, where the inactivity gap between men and women is particularly high. And you see these numbers here on the right, which indicates you how much GDP per capita could increase for these countries if women were to integrate the labor market to the same extent as in high income countries. Now, obviously, it's illusionary to believe that it will happen quickly. Some countries do move ahead, but there are major barriers, cultural speaking, economically, etc. But there is just to show you how big the impact could be if women would participate at a much higher rate in these countries for their living standards. The one thing that where we again see this interaction between these different challenges that I mentioned is in the beginning is in terms of the technological revolution that we have kind of looked into a bit more closely here. One of the consequences that the tech revolution had, apart from, let's say, introducing new new goods and services is and strong concentration effect. So market concentration has increased, not only in the tech sector. I mean, there are long-standing trends beyond that. And what it does is two things. I mean, the one thing is relatively easy or intuitive to understand, which is the chart on the right. Like increasing labor market power, labor market concentration increases wage inequality. So young those people at the bottom of the income distribution will benefit or will kind of experience a stronger decline in their labor market experience than those at the top, and so that's kind of in a sense reflected in that chart. What is more interesting is on the left side is that even despite the fact that you do have um, these new technologies, as the market power becomes more and more concentrated, these companies have a tendency to or have less and less of an incentive to introduce them, because the pressure that they receive from higher wages is weakened simply because they are setting the wage rates on the market. So it's this what economists call this a monopsonistic situation, where essentially you have one of few employers facing a lot of workers chasing few jobs, and in that situation, you actually as an employer have simply not enough incentive to introduce new technologies, because you can afford to lower the wages that you offer the many workers that are chasing the few jobs. And so that is something where where this concentration effect, whether tech or not, really has a negative implication on the transition or the transmission of new technologies to productivity. See, there's a question. Let's see. Let me answer that question if you allow at the end, because I think, as I said here, I wanted to focus for the moment on the story, and then if there are technical questions, I'm happy to answer them now. But otherwise, the more broader issues, let's put them at the end. So what I wanted to do in the next section is to kind of see what are the focus areas. So I've given you the big picture. If you want, now I wanted to see what are the focus areas that we need to kind of dive in a bit further. The first one, and interest is maybe interesting or surprising, I don't know however you look at it, is sickness absenteeism. Remains an important topic and an issue. So unfortunately, the data that I have stopped somehow in 22. I've just before the webinar double checked, but there's still no updates for 2023. There are some countries, as you see underneath, a few countries have more recent information. But what is striking is across the board for European countries, with few exceptions. Sickness absenteeism has increased over the last few years. No, you can say that that's probably related to COVID, and as COVID is slowly, kind of disappearing including from memories, maybe this absenteeism also will calm down. Also, I mean, anecdotal evidence for when you hear from different countries, for instance, my home country in Germany, is still absenteeism still remains an important topic, and partly because of the fact that as there are shortages on the labor market, workers tend to use that possibility to simply kind of have more take more freedom in terms of whether or not they take leave from their jobs. But underlying these short-term trends, if you want, is a longer-term trend, and this is from a publication that the OECD published a few years ago, where you see that disability is actually something that also has increased over a long time. So this is data before COVID. So COVID is not included in this chart. And what you can see here is this disability incidence has increased over the last 20 years or so, including if you control by age or education. So it's not that because we have shifted our demographics or so that disability has increased. And so the concern is obviously that if you don't believe that somehow we are all becoming more frail over time, then something else must have happened. And the most likely explanation is that governments have used disability as a way of hiding inactivity rates over this period. I know from some country studies that I was involved in myself that some countries indeed used disability as a way of getting around the problem that they have observed increasing inactivity rates. So in a sense, it's shifting people from from one box into another, with the disadvantage that if once you're in the disability box, there is, despite the fact that you might actually have some remaining capacity to work, you are no longer entitled to a certain number of labor market policies that would be beneficial for you. And if you think that you do these people actually a favor, you don't. Because often a lot of these people have maybe not 100% capacity to work, but maybe a 50 or 25%. And if you don't offer their people these chances to do that, they feel excluded, not only from the labor market but socially overall. And that's certainly not something that we want to encourage. So that's the first point where I think we need to, as policymakers, need to focus a bit more. The second point is, obviously, as countries become richer, people tend to work less. That maybe with the exclusion of the United States, where average hours worked have relatively remained relatively stable. For here, if you look at European countries over the last 50 years or so, average hours worked have declined. Now, this is obviously, so this is from a study that the IMF did some years ago. It conflates a bit different trends. It's not only that people on average work less hours per week, it's also there's an increasing incident of part-time work. And by the way, not only women who work part-time, so it's a lot of men also who started to work part-time. Germany is a key example here. The red dotted line you see, work part-time has increased significantly, and again that kind of is the flip side to what I was showing you at the beginning. That on average, average hours worked have declined, and so you can see that here that's actually a long-term trend. So question obviously is that just an income effect, so people become richer and they don't want to work less, or is it also related to tax benefit system? And the answer is probably both. From what we know is the tax system can create significant disincentives, especially for second earners, to fully participate or to at least work full time in the labor market. So if there are tax related issues that explain these trends, there certainly needs to be a focus area as well. The third focus area is encourage transitions. Now, something that is inevitable with population aging is the fact that older workers simply move less. I mean, I think I don't know how old you all are, but as you get older, you tend to work less, so to switch jobs less often. You also might have difficulties for different reasons to switch jobs, but the problem is that with this worker job allocation engine, as it slows down, it creates more and more mismatches. Simply because you might still feel like confident in your job, but maybe the job has changed and you're no longer capable of performing as you would have done in the past. You see that here. That's actually a very interesting chart. If you look at the job-to-job transition rates by age, that significantly declines as you move from a younger from younger population to from youth population to, let's say, middle age and then older population. And so it's a significant drop in terms of your job-to-job transition rates that you face. And again, it's something to take into account. Obviously, we can't change the fact that people get older, but we certainly need to encourage and identify what barriers to transition exist and that need to be overcome. a lot of companies are actually still reluctant to hire older workers for reasons that I have to say are not entirely clear to me. But it seems that there is some kind of inherent concern that older people are maybe less willing or less capable of adjusting to a new position. And so often when it comes down to hiring older workers, even workers that are still in employment, companies are reluctant to do that. So that was focus number three. Then focus number four, I think it's a key concern now, and I mean probably one of the biggest stumble blocks that we face in terms of addressing labor market shortages. It's the slowdown in productivity growth, and it's something that I mean, it's still a puzzle. There's all kinds of theories around. I don't want to go into this in this webinar. And we have in the World Employment Social Outlook Trends Report 2023, so 2 years ago, we have had a special chapter on this. If you want to check it out, where we discuss all these different approaches, theories. None of them is really convincing, to be fair. And what is surprising is that despite the fact that we would expect all these accelerations and productivity growth from technology, we actually don't see that. We just see the opposite, and that is true, including for emerging economies. Here on the second part of the chart, shows you the numbers for China, India, and Brazil. Brazil is actually frustrating because it's an emerging economy and the productivity growth is negative, which is absolutely devastating for the country. But even for China, which is the star performer in these charts, usually productivity growth has declined. And what it means is that what you see on the right side is that annual wage growth also has kind of declined over time. I mean, there's a bit of a pickup now in 2024, but when you look at the gap that has been created with COVID, you see that that gap has still not closed completely. And what it also means is, in relation to the previous focus area, to the transition focus area, is that as wage growth is slower, companies also have less possibilities to actually create attractive jobs. And one of the reasons that we see certain sectors really facing significant shortages is that their working conditions are not attractive. And they're not attractive because these sectors cannot produce in sufficient productivity growth to actually offer attractive conditions for workers to switch to these sectors. And so it's a vicious circle. So you have low productivity growth, you create less good working conditions, and you attract less workers, and that in itself, makes that whole process of slow productivity growth coming full circle. And then the last point is on skills. I have the rest of the presentation is a bit in along these lines, but I wanted to show you this is this is a summary statistic or summary a chart from a recent publication that I did with some colleagues, where we looked into the question of whether or not, or what type of skills are actually needed for people to help people to kind of succeed in the labor markets. So this data is done, or this analysis was done with data for European data before COVID. So again, the COVID is excluded here. And what it shows is, it shows two charts. One is on the employment changes, and the other one is on gross earning growth over the last decade. And the question was, to what extent are digital skills helping people, A, to remain in a job, and B, if they have lost the job, to get a new job? And the surprising answer in that paper that we give is that in most cases, digital skills just don't play any role at all. They don't help you to stay employed. So if you look at these red boxes, these are estimates of the impact of digital skills on employment changes, on gross earnings. But the reason that they're only boxes and not solidly shaped is that none of these effects are statistically significant. So if you do the estimation, it's simply saying that you can't distinguish them statistically from zero. And so essentially, I mean, I can't comment on them because they just don't give any information on the importance of digital skills for people. And that is regardless of whether they are high skilled or low skilled or medium skilled. What is interesting, however, is that when you look into job seekers, there, and you look at specifically on the right side there, the impact of digital skills seem to be significant. So you see that solid blue boxes, they indicate the fact that they're solidly shaped indicate that these estimates are actually statistically significant, but they're only significant for job seekers. So that means that actually if you are not employed, if you're looking for a job, then digital skills make a difference, and probably simply not because you need them or somehow you kind of stand out from the rest of the crowd by having these skills on your CV. And so the bottom line of this work, and I mean, if you want, I've referenced the paper in the PowerPoint presentation, which I can share with you later on. The bottom line of this is to say that people actually do need digital skills mostly as a signaling device, as giving a signal to their employer, their potential employer, not because these skills are of any particular value, but simply because they differentiate yourself from somebody else who is also competing with you on a similar job, which is very much different to what the standard discourse is on skills, on especially on digital skills. All right. So what are the solutions for all these issues that I mentioned? First of all, so I think that the importance point is really these component transitions to new skills and new occupations, I think, and not only locally but even globally. I think that the importance is really that in order to make this labor market work properly again, we need to accelerate and facilitate transitions. Obviously, that means identify relevant skills. I already mentioned that digital skills might be not the only skill that is relevant, and you see increasingly the recognition that skills need to be complementary to machine skills, whether it's communication skills, whether it's social skills, problem-solving skills, etc. So you need to maybe have skills that are different. Not everybody needs to be a mathematician or programmer, but there's skills that you need to have that are complementary to machine skills. And maybe skills that are needed across many occupations. Again, something cross-cutting skills that are relevant in this. So, but these you need to identify this, and it's often something that is specific to each sector or specific to a particular country. There are institutions that are doing this. Where I work in Switzerland, there is St. University Institute in Lausanne that does this kind of identification. There are other examples, but across Europe. But I think it's important to have this kind of skills identification and mapping exercise, and that becomes increasingly important. Once you have identified the skills, the second point will be to support transitions, and here obviously very standard things like career guidance systems, social protection, etc. I think it's important, but maybe what is even more important is to have a long-term vision of where people should navigate through in the labor market. So to create actually what some people call a skills ecosystem. There's a program in Singapore, Skills Future Singapore, which does that, and so that program really identifies possibilities for people to navigate throughout the Singaporean labor market. And then the last point, I think this is obviously something that depending on where exactly people stand on this, but is to support and facilitate migration. Work migration. That obviously requires, from an ILO point of view at least, requires obviously a certain number of protections. So migrants are not, they need to benefit from the same type of protection that workers in the host countries have. But more importantly, you often will need to invest in their education before they actually come. There are some recently countries have started dual skills partnerships between European countries and countries in Latin America, Africa, and I think in Asia as well, and with the Philippines. But what this actually means is that you invest in skills of people before they come to Europe. That you don't bring them in and then hope that they somehow have the right skills. So you really kind of invest and identify the right skills that you need before people can. And that sometimes is often simply language skills. I mean, I mean, again, my home country, Germany. German is not necessarily an easy language, but what you can and should do is you invest in these language skills, especially when you have people that you want to work in certain social services like healthcare or personal care services. You need a minimum language skill to be able to exchange with your patient. The other part related to that skills ecosystem I mentioned before is the fact that you need to identify or have a better identification of skills overlap for different sectors or different occupation. Here, this is a chart that I took from Nesta, the innovation accelerator in the UK, where they identified at a relatively granular level for jobs in each sector the type of skills or similarity to the nearest job in other sectors. And so you see that some sectors have a relatively large overlap in terms of the competences and skills that they need, and others maybe not so much. But the important point is, rather than having broad job categories, you really need to identify granular skills and competences for each job to be able to identify these transitions. And I think that if this obviously requires quite a bit of work, it's mostly done for public employment services, not something that necessarily companies will have to do, but it would be important to have this type of mapping and obviously dynamically done over time so that it's being updated regularly, simply to identify how much of your skills are overlapping with other sectors so that you can facilitate that transition. And then a last point is, also develop a bit of a lifelong perspective on these things. Because we all face in our respective occupations some traps. So here on the left side, this is a chart that we did based on transitions in the US. And you see that other than that green category in the middle, which is around 50% of all occupation, you see a lot of professional occupation that are kind of very small traps, if you want, or small pockets only. And once you're in that pocket, it's extremely difficult to transition out. Some pockets might be a bit easier, healthcare, etc., but others, you will face significant lock-in effects once you have yourself identified in that particular sector. And the problem is often that you actually have difficulties to document the kind of skills that you have that would overlap with other occupation. If you think about the previous chart that I showed you, in many sectors, in many fields, you have actually a strong overlap between in terms of skills and competences between sectors. But it's really difficult to document it, especially if you think about longer of your lifelong career. And so this is on the right side is a chart from McKinsey, where they try to identify or try to measure how much of your skills are actually implicit in your work experience and not explicit in terms of certificates. And you see that as you get older and accumulate more seniority, that blue shaped area becomes larger and larger. And at the end of your working life is around 60% of your actual competences, if you want, as measured by your wages, are not documented in any way, and make it extremely difficult for people to move. And again, if you think about what I mentioned earlier in terms of one of the focus areas of transitioning or supporting transition for older workers, that explains to a large extent why older workers have difficulties to change, because they have difficulties to document exactly what type of skills they have. And so one of the key policy areas that we kind of need to focus on in the next few years as well is to have ways of better documenting the type of skills, the type of competences that people have when they grow more senior in their roles. And there are possibilities like micro credentials, but these are not, for the moment, standardized tools that we use in the labor market. So I leave you with that. Here, this is some of the publication that we have done over the last few years. You see on the right, this is the latest employment trends report. There's a whole series. So I think this thing goes back to the 2014 or 15. So have a look at it, see whether you find it interesting, and please reach out to me if you want any further information on this. So I stop sharing, and I'm looking forward to some questions.
Super. Thank you very much, Ekkehard. That was a really interesting discussion on a very important topic. So I'm very much looking forward to the questions that come in. I will give people some time to send some in. I see that we've got one here already that came in during the presentation. And they're asking, how does rising wealth inequality in Western societies affect the labor market, particularly in terms of job opportunities and wages? Additionally, what are its broader implications for economic growth?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I mean, I think that, it links back very nicely to what I mentioned earlier about labor market concentration. I mean, this wealth inequality means that you have strong concentration of economic power among certain companies or certain economic actors. Now, I'm not necessarily only talking about the political economy implication, and that in itself kind of probably would merit a whole webinar. But it's simply talking about the economic concentration that wealth inequality brings with it, means that the labor market will become less competitive. And I think that, I used it, I tried to explain it before briefly that we talk about labor market monopsony. So when you have one employer or very few employers that face a certain number of, a large number of job seekers. In that situation, you as an employer have the possibility to impose wages, and there's enough evidence now, and it's not only in the tech sector, by the way. It's also in retail. I mean, if Walmart comes into a certain area, typically it not only displaces all other retailers, but it also creates these conditions that it's essentially the only employer in town, and over time will kind of limit the opportunities for people to switch. And so this kind of concentration is really what is very concerning. Not only from a political economy point of view, but simply from an economic efficiency point of view. So yes. And the broader economic implication is that it because of its shifting resources towards few companies or individuals will also mean that you have a less dynamic economy. Again, as I mentioned before, new technologies might get introduced a bit more slowly, and importantly, economic growth in itself will slow down. So I think that part of the reason why we see that slowdown in growth has to do with the fact that we have this concentration or concentrated economic activities.
Yeah, I found that a really interesting topic while you were talking, actually, looking at the monopsonistic kind of labor market in that perspective. I just wondered what do you think then would need to happen for looking at the kind of tech industry in particular? What do you think would need to happen for us to kind of reap those productivity benefits that could potentially accrue but are not because of the market structure of this?
Yeah, this is an extremely important topic, and there are no easy answers. I mean, to be frank, I mean, I know that some people think that we just do the same as we did with telecom or with electricity in the 1980s. It doesn't work the same way, and partly because the sector is very dynamic overall. It's very complicated to maintain that innovative capacity while at the same time making sure that the economic resources are not so concentrated. One of the answers that I tend to give on this, and I'm pleased to see that this has taken hold more widely, is that we probably will need to have a much more activist state that will use its capacity to invest in these companies and to identify areas where productivity growth could be enhanced. One of the examples I always give is when you think about the capacity of these tools to help us navigate, for instance, in mobility systems. I mean, we all face. I guess you're based in London. We all face major bottlenecks in our mobility systems, and there's just so many roads that you can build, or so many additional train lines, etc. Um, And one of the key advantages that these tools have potentially is to help us, use our mobility systems more efficiently. There are other examples in waste management, in electricity, etc. But the problem is that often these companies do not have an incentive, or they do not have the capacity to invest in infrastructure to the same extent as countries. So one possibility would be to say, well, actually here are major productivity gains to be had, but it requires co-investment by companies. Well, sorry, by public partners. Another example that is also extremely relevant. One of the least productive sectors in any economy in advanced economies is construction. It's unbelievable that construction has actually not seen productivity increase over the last 50 years. It's really something that it's striking if you look at the numbers. You can't really understand why you don't see that. And part of it is that they use essentially the same type of inefficient work processes that they have used in the 70s. There could be a case to be made for public procurement system to force companies to use much more efficient digital planning tools. When you talk to big companies, they're actually aware of it, and these things that exist. It's not that they don't exist. It's just that you need a public provider that forces these companies once and for all to use them. And so here, as I said, it's not so much mission orientation. It's more like you actually need some coordination device, and the state can activate or act as a coordinator in some of these things. It's very sector specific. I mean, you can't really give a cross-cutting answer to all sectors. So you have to identify where exactly the bottlenecks are for these productivity gains. But there are bottlenecks in many sectors where we could identify and use the coordinating power of the public hand to advance this. Um, yeah, so what are the implications of increases in at-home working? I mean, first of all, the discussion so far seems to be that there is a bit of a backslash right now to teleworking. You see that a bit everywhere. I think that a lot of companies somehow are reluctant to continue being as flexible as they used to be. It's a bit of a fight between younger generations who want to actually benefit from this flexibilities, and older people and older generation that kind of don't understand the use of of teleworking. I see this also at the ILO. I mean, when I look at some of my older colleagues, senior colleagues, they somehow are still reluctant to let people go on teleworking. I think that in principle, it's productivity enhancing. I mean, the evidence that we have so far, look at Nicholas Bloom. Nick Bloom in Stanford? He has done extensive work on this. The evidence seems to be that it's a productivity enhancing. Maybe not massively, but it certainly helps. People can more easily navigate their work, obligations, their home applications at home, and it helps them to maybe be also more productive. I find, I mean, from a research point of view, and here I mean talking about my own experience, I find it also very fascinating that you start collaborating with more easily with people across different continents even, which I haven't done before to the same extent before the Zoom calls became a necessity. And I mean, it looks like if you combine these tools properly, they can actually help to improve productivity. Again, it's probably not massive, and the question is obviously to what extent will we continue teleworking? It looks like there seems to be some kind of steady state around 20%, so one day per week that people tend to telework, but not permanently more. I mean, 100% teleworking jobs do exist, but they're extremely rare, and they're probably not becoming more frequent in the future.
Interesting, thank you. Um, I did, sorry, before I move on, if anybody would have any further questions, feel free to just pop them into the Q&A section. But I did want to pick up on your thoughts on the kind of lack of impact, or kind of the impact of digital skills mainly as a signal. I found that quite interesting because I remember when I was younger, that was the thing that was being pushed more than anything, really. Um, And yeah, how necessary has it been? But I guess looking at that idea more broadly, how how then do you go about trying to identify those skills of the future? If that's kind of yeah, what process will that take? How can you not be sure, but how can you even have any idea that anything might necessarily be particularly useful as opposed to anything else?
I mean, one of the answers to that question is that you have a lot of professional bodies who kind of help companies and workers to identify what type of skills are needed in the next 5 to 10 years. I think that from an employer's point of view, what will be important is also to say, well, we need to put some scenarios out. We need to identify, what is the company likely to do in the next 5, 10 years? Which kind of sectors, which kind of markets do we want to engage in? Do we need more language skills because all of a sudden, China becomes important, so we need to all learn Chinese, or do we kind of transition to a completely new type of sector, etc. So I think that this is something that an employer obviously needs to engage in, and depending on the size of the company, obviously, you will have more or less resources for that. For workers or for employees, let's say, especially for younger people, I get this question often. So what should I learn? And I mean, the answer is simply that you cannot possibly anticipate what's going to happen over the next 50 years. I mean, if you are in your mid 20s or early to mid 20s, it's impossible to, I mean, nobody can give you the answer to that. Huh? Yes, if you're lucky, you enter an occupation or a job that will allow you to stay in that same kind of line of business for the rest of your working life, but most people don't. And I think that the key point, and this is something where policymakers obviously come in, is the key point is to remain flexible, to be open-minded, to be interested in, let's say, exploring maybe your options as well. If you let's say after 10 years, you're in your mid-30s, you figure out, oh, the job I hate the job that I'm doing, and I don't see any kind of future in it, then by all means try to make sure that you have opportunities to go somewhere else. And policymakers obviously need to offer that possibilities. We're talking about lifelong learning, but we have been talking about this for the last 50 years again, and yet the institutions are still not there. I mean, we are still very much focused in terms of our education system over the first 20 years, and then once you're out on the market, then there's very little things that you can do. So it's a financing issue. So how do we actually offer possibilities? And some countries have kind of found solution, or at least proposed some solutions to that. But I think that more broadly, we need a better understanding of what policymakers can do. My colleague is currently preparing a report in the research department and on lifelong learning. So we are all looking forward to her answer. Maybe I come back in a year's time or so, and then I give you her answers. So
Perfect. That'd be
yeah.
great.
Um,
Um, yeah, so there's another question from the audience. What are the impacts of prioritizing local workforce over migrants on productivity? They've said that many countries have such policies, including some of the fastest growing economies, such as Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I mean, obviously, in countries like Saudi Arabia, it is key for policymakers to make sure that they offer opportunities for their local workforce to integrate the labor market, and that goes beyond, let's say, public sector employment. I mean, especially in Gulf countries, a lot of employment is still created in public sector, and that is not a long-term solution. So yes, in these countries, it certainly makes a lot of sense to prioritizing the local workforce. But and nevertheless, you see, even in those countries, you can't fill all vacancies that you have with the local workforce. I mean, especially in construction, you will simply not find them, and so you will have to identify sector-specific solutions to that. Ideally, you don't want to you don't want to make a priority for hiring people locally, and then not giving them the right skills. I think that this needs to be sustainable. So protecting jobs or kind of restricting, the entry of non-locals to certain jobs is not helping. It's more a question of upskilling or reskilling for local workforce. But I mean, I totally understand the economic rationale for that.
Okay. On that note, then, as we're heading towards 8 o'clock, I think we will leave that as the last question. Just a big thank you to Ekkehard for taking your time and delivering such thought-provoking and insightful presentation, really. I've very much enjoyed it and taken a lot from it, so thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
No problem at all. Thank you to everybody else who has joined as well, and anybody watching the recording once that goes out as well. Just for those of you that are here, our next event will be on the 25th of March with Mira Sabaratnam, who's an associate professor in international relations at the University of Oxford. And she'll be with us discussing issues around complex indebtedness. Do feel free to have a look on our website, sign up to our newsletter for any updates around that. But other than that, once again, thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
For having me. Thanks a lot.